The Dr. Oba Tashaka Show. Free your mind, and the rest will follow. A show for all who are on the journey to discover the truths about their identity, history, culture, politics, spirituality, and family relationships. This is a show for the Black Freedom Movement and the Black Power generation and the hip-hop generation, including Black Lives Matter and associate activists, all of whom are seeking change. Dr. Oba Tashaka and his guests are dropping knowledge and insight from his successful organizing, research, writings, and innovative thoughts, the best of which have piped into God's mind to lift you up higher and higher. To the bosses, OGs, rappers, influencers, and those looking to evolve from the constraints of misinformation and miseducation to build a foundation for personal growth, love, and mental freedom. Check out the wisdom of the OR. Yeah, that's the original revolutionary, Oba T, who inspired 1 million black men with his rousing speech at the Million Man March, and who continues to fight, write, and speak the truth. Dr. Oba Tashaka is one of the deepest deep thinkers in the world today. A quote by Dr. Asa Hilliard. Dr. Oba Tashaka, then Bill Bradley, was the best leader organizer in the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE. An endorsement from Dr. George Wiley, Associate Director of National CORE and the best organizer blacks produced in the 1970s as the organizer of the National Welfare Rights Organization. The Dr. Oba Tashaka Show. Free your mind, and the rest will follow.
Good morning and greetings to all you beautiful viewers of the Dr. Oba Tashaka Show. How you all doing? You hip? You okay? What I want to do is say that I really appreciate you all, and I've been for about the last 128 shows, been doing my best. I just want to acknowledge some of the viewers here. Ancient African Mindset, who was the first one to put himself up on the chat board. Greetings. Stephen McKenzie, good to see you again. Brother Ogawa, one of the hardest working brothers in the internet business, the Afronet, I should say. Mildred Parks, right on, all the way from McDonough, Georgia. Hey. Wolf Manlu, very serious brother who's been watching the show. Appreciate you. Shonda Henderson, greetings. Loud to Zoo, LaShonda Henderson. I got your number. I'm going to be calling you. Don't think I forgot about that. Yvette Anderson, who we picked up on the last show. I hope you got something out of that discussion on independent Black education. Abdul Rahman. And let's see if got anybody. I think those are it. So greetings to you and those who will be tuning in. Last week's show rates among our best because it didn't just focus on independent Black education, a school that I founded, African Children's Advanced Learning Center, but the teachers who have maintained it for 51 years. I founded it, but other people kept it going. And you saw two of those, Ustadi Kadiri and Robert Woods, master teachers. But what made this show exceptional was their method of teaching. I mean, it hit right on the head, like a hammer on the head of a nail, on what I'm dealing with in this book, Seba, but it's very practical. And they focused on bringing out, which is what Seba is, as Ustadi said, the best of what's within a person. And then they laid out their methodology. And bad. And they made the point that 98% of our students go to college, 50% get scholarships. But anyone that graduates from that school is going to be either a B plus or an A student, a real B plus or A student. But their method is what's key. And of course, what drives the method is their philosophy. These are African conscious brothers. And so next week, we're going to do a part 2 on this. And this is going to follow through on a deeper dive into some of the points that they made in part 1. For example, how do you develop self-discipline among our youth? And I was very disappointed to see the low number of people that watched that show. And especially for YouTube, because Facebook the viewers seem to like stuff on ancient Africa and anything that's got to do with anything political or whatever. They don't tend to have that much interest. But I was kind of surprised that more of our YouTube viewership didn't watch that, because what is the point of all this discussion of African history and culture and spirituality if we're not applying it, and most importantly, to uplifting and strengthening our youth? And this is a 51-year institution, solely Black financed. So those that you have missed it, and I know it's not the people I'm talking to here for the most part, because you watch most of the shows, you're really missing something. That's all I'm saying. And more important, when the grade point average of the average Black student in high school is 1.3, 1.4. The sisters have about a 0.2% higher grade point average than the brothers. F and D minus. And we're not interested in this? That's our future. And one of the problems is it's in someone else's hands. And we're up around here moaning and groaning about all the disorders we have and everything else. And yeah, I understand we're under oppression. But the first thing we got to do is aid our young people in freeing their minds. So I was really proud of what they presented. We're going to do a deeper dive into that next week. Now, one of our most dedicated viewers, her and her husband, but Lady X Mosley has been very ill, and she sent some pictures on Facebook where she's in her house with intravenous infusion because she can't eat right now, and she needs all the support she can get from our viewers. This is a family, and this is a real conscious sister. She had been in the what they call the baby SEALs, SEALs. The SEALs are the most elite of the American military units. And she was athletic, she still is, and, doing all kinds of stuff. But since being out of the military, she's had numerous operations. I assume it's stuff that she got while she was there. And it's, she needs support. So we'll post on the page for this show, where you go to when you're clicking in to watch the show other than the live show. We'll post her email address and send her a message, encouraging her to recover and let her know you're praying for her. That's a real beautiful sister, along with her husband, who gives her a lot of love and is looking out for her. So this is real important. Now, I also want to thank a brother who has been watching our show. His name is Enoch Hankerson. And Enoch was kind enough to send me a number of cartouches that are his works that are really nice. And I just wanted to thank him for this. Women of Power. This is one on African women in Kemet. He sent me another one on great kings and queens of Kemet. And another one on the Olmecs, showing the variety, the Olmecs are the mother civilization of Mesoamerica. They're African. If you read Ivan Van Sertima's book, they came before Columbus. He documents that in that book. And these are the founders of the first civilization in Mesoamerica, which is where Mexico is and other areas in that region. So I want to thank Enoch Hankerson for sending this, and also for having an interest in the show. I really appreciate it. Appreciate the love you all are showing. Of course, you could also put some money in this, because I put out a huge amount of my own money, and I know some people see where it's going back. We're mastering this, and I understand it goes into a card. We just have to get this out, and we will. So I wanted to thank him. I just want to make a comment before getting into the show. We have a problem with understanding what power is and what a victory is. Now, some of us understand this, and we can even quote definitions of power. But a lot of us are in the powerless mentality of, they took our culture. They're stepping all over us. And it boils down to, well, it doesn't look like there's much we can do. Yet we've had many victories in this long road for liberation, one of which was kicking Trump out of the White House, and we were preparing him for the jailhouse. That was a Black victory. But the fact that there were not national celebrations all over the country, had Jews been able to remove Hitler, you think there would have been some celebrations? I think so. If Native Americans had been able to stop the genocide, you think there'd be celebration? But they celebrate for the victories they have, like Little Bighorn, That's where Sitting Bull whipped Custer's behind. You know what I mean? Every people celebrate their victories. And one reason is they know what a victory is. And I've been talking to a friend of mine who's making the point, some of us aren't clear on what a victory is. So some of us, we don't even mention it. It's like nothing, and then we'll say, well, there's no difference between Trump and Biden. Oh, yeah. If you had a chance to see him in a second term, you'd see fascism rear its head live and strong. And so the fact that this boy is, even though it's one of the lesser charges, they are felonies, and over 30 of them, is facing felony charges, is due to you and our allies that put him out of the White House. And in one of the first shows I did, I predicted the strategy that was behind Black Lives Matter and the great movement that occurred then, and predicted that we'd be putting him out of the White House, preparing him for the jailhouse. And so now it's just going to be a matter of how many indictments and convictions he's going to face. And what makes him sad makes me glad. You know what I mean? So I just wanted to note that. Even though the Attorney General Garland should have prosecuted him a long time ago for January the 6th. And it seems like they're playing around. So I want to get into today's topic. Now, I'm a historian, a philosopher, a political theorist with a whole bunch of different areas that I master. And one of the things about me is, and this was true of John Henry Clark, and I didn't copy him. One of the reasons why I picked him as a master is we had this similar interest. My interest in Africa is not focused solely or exclusively on Kemet. It's one of the civilizations that I'm interested in, but I'm interested in all of Africa. And then I'm interested in the African contribution to the world. And then I'm interested in world history. So this discussion we're going to have today is a part of a systematic laying out of a theory of world history starting in Africa that I've developed. And so today I'm focusing on another area. And this one is a neglected area. So what we find is that a number of past shows have placed an important emphasis on the Twa because they're at the foundation of civilization, and they are the world's first people. And they have the most far-flung and most just of civilizations and extremely creative. So that's been the focus of past shows, along with looking at an area of Kemet neglected by most of our historians on ancient Kemet, what I call the ancient period of the great ones, the Anu. They call themselves the great ones. I redefine this period because pre-dynastic's incorrect. I've gone through why before. I've looked at the Twa and spent a lot of time on them because they're the foundation. They're neglected. And you're not going to understand African history and its contribution to world history if you don't understand the foundation. And then my approach to that's original. God's visited me with some stuff that has enabled me to add something to this very important. So that has been the focus, along with the Anu period when it comes to history. But today, the show will focus on Africa's gift of democracy to the world through looking at the first agricultural societies created in the world, created in Africa. So it's going to focus on another neglected area. And it's going to really focus on how central real democracy is to African American, African diasporan culture. We're living in a society that pretends to be a democracy. This is a hypocrisy. This is a republic, and a republic is a system where you elect people to office and then they do what they want to do. And pretty well, as Aristotle said, he favored aristocracy over any system, but he found the Republican form of government to be more stable because people get to vote, they get the illusion of power, but they end up voting the same people into office. That's a profound insight there. You know what I mean? One way to describe the Democratic and Republican Party is two parties, one wing, both right wing, you know? think it was Gore Vidal that came up with that term. I don't steal people's stuff. Yet there is a reason for keeping Trump out of office. So don't come up saying that. And I see, I think Wolf Manley said something about New York was the first one. But yeah, that's the nature of it. But they've all been playing around because they should have had this man indicted and in prison 6 months after he was out of office. You know what I mean? Even before that. So this focus is going to be on a neglected area. Africa's role in creating democracy, particularly in the agricultural societies. So the topic for today is Africa, the birthplace of democracy, and a central principle in African American culture. Now, you notice one of my approaches is to use the past to transform the present. And so, in looking at the earliest agricultural democracies created in Africa and the earliest in the world for agrarian systems, I'm going to be examining, first of all, what those societies were and are, why I'm focusing on them, what are the elements that make them what they are, and then how did we carry some of the principles from these societies into the Americas, with my focus on, of course, Africans in the United States, but they carried these principles all over the diaspora. So that's the real point. And the topic will be an unusual one for a lot of you. Africa, the birthplace of democracy, and a central principle in African American culture, because some of you probably not even sure that democracy is a key component of African American culture. I know most people in here know you got a culture, but a lot of us don't even think we have one. So this is going to cover some new ground that is important for today, but understanding our history yesterday. History, John Henry Clark used to define it as a clock, and that's fine. And I can say many other things about it. History is a cyclical study that is spiral in motion. History rarely even looks like it's repeating itself. Sometimes it looks like it, but it really isn't. But it is also a cyclical study. And the cycles of history, as you've seen me use precessional cycles as a measure for ancient Kemetic history, is a zigzag history. It's a spiral. It's not a circle. It doesn't rotate like the moon. It rotates like most of the planets in a zigzag spiral motion. And our culture is pretty well attuned to that, both African and African American culture. But history is also a weapon. Of course, you'd expect me to say that. But it is a weapon because your opponent, your oppressor, in being successful in conquering African people, Asian, Native American, and others, then went about the process of writing them out of history or writing their version of history, which is his story. So part of the weapon of history, along with the struggles that we do for liberation, which is making history, is that it's got to serve as a sharp knife, as an explosive bullet, as a weapon that you can wield to regain your power. So this is a real key point, and it's why we need to use the past for lessons that we can use to transform our present. History also gives us a deep sense of our self-knowledge. And when we have that knowledge, which is combined with the deep sense of African culture, then we are also in a position to empower ourselves. I notice Wolf Manley making the point that Dr. Finch also focuses on ancient African history, particularly the Chouath and ancient Kemet. And as he also pointed out, the Dogon. Yeah, and he just put out a new book on ancient Kemet, and you should check it out. Dr. Finch is really good. I like him, especially a Star of Deep Beginnings. That's exceptional. Now today, I want to give special praise to the great African-American historian, Dr. Chancellor Williams. Dr. Williams deserves special praise for his intellectual work and the way in which he put forward his ideas to free the African mind. This is a picture, I've shown this to you before, of Dr. Chancellor Williams at a conference at an organization that I organized in the 70s called the Pan-African Secretariat of North America. We organized State of the Race conferences for about 5 or 6 years, bringing in 1,000 Black folks from around the world, and we had John Henry Clark, Doc Ben, and many others, and Chancellor Williams. And the one sitting there with a tie, that's Chancellor Williams. Person next to him is May Mallory, and the sister on his side is Queen Mother Moore. And then the picture, the person with the big natural with the ivory watch band, that's me. And my friend Kay Indy. And the person sitting next to Queen Mother Moore is a brother with the glasses on, is a brother named Yemi Toure. He conceived of the State of the Race conferences. And then we have other notables in the background. So Chancellor Williams is a giant among giants. And I want to pay homage to him and note briefly his contributions, because what I'm doing today, I'll draw a little from him. I'll be mainly dealing with my own thrust on this, but he has his own work on this. It was excellent. And if you see any critique here of his work, it's only because myself and others have come up with some other insights that add to this. And today I'll be talking about some of mine that add to his own insights on African and African-American history, particularly African history. Now, the two exceptional intellectual works that Dr. Chancellor Williams did was the book Destruction of Black Civilization and the Rebirth of Black Civilization. And the second one was the Rebirth of African Civilization. This is one of the issues of his book on destruction, right here. This is the hardback version, Destruction of Black Civilization. And this is the original version put out when the book first came out. Destruction of Black Civilization, Great Issues of a Race from 4500 BC to 2000 AD. So this work's important. And then the work that's a little read by most people that read him is the Rebirth of African Civilization. Now, destruction of Black civilization is very important for a number of reasons, because Dr. Chancellor Williams is doing a survey of ancient African civilizations, including Kemet. And then he has a special focus on one topic that I'll discuss in a minute, which I think is the most important chapter in the book. I'll come to that in a minute. His other book, Rebirth of African Civilization, I consider to be his best work. They're both classics. They're both outstanding. Hardly any writers write a single classic, let alone two. But I think that Rebirth of African Civilization even stands out more, though they're both important. John Henry Clark agreed with that. That was his position. This is mine. I didn't get mine from him. He didn't get his from me, obviously. So the reason that Rebirth of African Civilization is so important is because Dr. Chancellor Williams went to Ghana in the mid-50s, and after mortgaging his house to pay for the research that he would do on this trip, he interviewed thousands of Ghanaians on what kind of society they wanted when they became independent. And at this point, they were on the verge of independence. Kwame Nkrumah supported him in this work. So it's the insights gained from what Ghanaians said about the future, not only of Ghana, but of Africa, that is most important. And the key point in this book is they said they did not want capitalism. They did not want Marxism. They wanted cooperative democracy. That was their way of saying they wanted communalism, which is what that was. They wanted a sharing economic system, and that also applied to the politics of the country. So that was the core of the work, and he got a lot of help from Ghanaians in doing this work. But he paid his own way. That's why his books are so important. They don't face the filter of some major white publishing house. So that is one of the reasons I'm praising him. But my main reason for praising him today is what I consider to be the most important chapter in Destruction of Black Civilization, the chapter entitled The African Constitution, Birth of Democracy. Some scholars have had trouble with this, including my master, Dr. Jacob Carruthers. And I remember when we were in a brain trust meeting in Chicago, preparing for the African-centered educational movement. This was in the 90s. And we were walking to his office. I made a comment that Chancellor Williams' work on African democracy was very important. And his response was, yeah, I'd like to see the data. And this has been a criticism that some people have made of destruction. Because by the time Chancellor Williams wrote the book, he was blind. So he had done the field research. And the key thing is about his work, whether it was the work on Rebirth of African Civilization or the work on destruction, he actually went to Africa and did his homework. And in this case, this particular chapter, he observed, while he could see, these particular societies that he believed served as the birthplace of democracy in Africa. So being blind, he couldn't list all of the societies that he had looked at, but he could summarize what he saw and you know, what he had in his notes. Probably somebody read it to him, you know. I can say, as someone who has studied these societies as well, lived in Africa in the villages for a while, but did not do the systematic study on the ground of the societies I'm going to talk about right now that Chancellor Williams did. His work is pristine. And while I'm going to critique a few differences I have, it's over more what we've learned since he's done this work about the perspective on these societies. But his work on this particular group of African societies that I'm going to focus on today, which are your first agricultural societies in Africa and in the world, that serve as the basis for what he called the African Constitution, which he entitles this chapter, The Birth of Democracy. It's extremely important because it's accurate. So I understood why he couldn't list the societies, but I had studied a lot of these societies and I knew what he was talking about, but he had studied them close up, so while his study is pristine and one of the best of this set of societies that I'm going to discuss today, I'm going to make some comments that will correct a few conclusions that Dr. Chancellor Williams made, not because he was in error at the time, but because at that time, lacking a focus on certain other dimensions of African history, he could miss something. So this is not some attempt to bring down his analysis. It's, for the most part, not only accurate, but magnificent. And I also like his style of writing, comprehensive, Now, according to Dr. Chancellor Williams, democracy was generally, I'm quoting him, democracy was generally the earliest system among various people throughout the ancient world. This is, end of quote. This is very accurate. Democracy is the oldest system of government in the world. You wouldn't think so if your focus is on Europe. And you wouldn't think so if your focus is on Kemet, even though, as I pointed out in my study and my shows on the Anu period, going back 10,000 BC, I showed you that the founders of Kemet, the Anu, came out of democratic societies and later give birth to a pharaonic system that was itself empowered through democratic means at certain period of history. I pointed out in one of the shows that in the early period of creating the pharaonic system, it was Shepsuts, where the term Hatshepsut comes. These were the great farmers of Kemet who were sisters. There was a certain period in Kemet where they picked the pharaoh. That's democracy. And it's females picking a male. So it's also bringing out another theme. So I see we're allowed to zoo. I am with Jake from Chicago. It's unfortunate Chancellor Williams did not include the note. He couldn't. He was blind. He couldn't. So it's only unfortunate for people that haven't studied this. Jake had not studied this. Jake's largest focus was on Kemet, though he did study the Dogon and some others. He didn't study these societies. You know what I mean? And had he done so, he wouldn't have said that, And I'm not knocking him for not studying it, because people study what they're interested in. So that's good. And he's one of my great masters. So Dr. Chancellor Williams is making this observation that democracy is the earliest system of governance in the world. And then he goes on to say the new development was absolute monarchy. That's a new development. And he could have gone on to say It was an innovation started by the Aryans. And you have some forms of it in Asia, but not as vicious as the one that you find in Europe, or the ones, because basically the absolute monarchies of Europe were like made up of the worst ones, meaning the rulers were the worst ones, meaning the most violent, the most vicious, the ones who did whatever they wanted to do. Whereas, and my day show's not going to focus on kingly systems or monarchies, but I want to make this contrast with Africa. Generally, the monarchs of Africa were the best men, kings, and women didn't have to prove that they were the best. The men actually had to. And they had to go through the filter of queen mothers in many cases. In the case of the Asante, they nominated the person who was most royal for kingship. So it was the best man that in Africa ended up ruling. But very often, it was a psychopathic person that ruled in Europe. And they had the right to do whatever they wanted to do. And their basic philosophy was power. Absolute, arbitrary, do what you want. And today, capitalism is based on that principle, in case you think it's changed. And the people who run this government are the ones that own it. And it's not the ones in the White House. So what you call despotism or dictatorship is a much newer feature, and you're going to see why in a minute. Now, Dr. Chancellor Williams also went on to assert a general view expressed by historians who specialize in Africa, whether they're African or European or whatever their ethnicity is. Dr. Williams wrote in Destruction of Black Civilization, quoting him again, that among Blacks, democratic institutions evolved and functioned in a socio-economic and political system which Western writers call stateless societies or societies without chiefs. Page 171 and through 173. Now, first of all, what does he mean? Stateless societies are societies in which you have no kings or queens, and generally they are not stratified societies. And there's no elite that rules in stateless societies. This is basically the nature of stateless societies. Now, by stateless, this is a term that Western historians have created to call these stateless societies. The state in the Western system refers to a nation, which is a people with a common history and culture, who have a state. We're a nation, but we lack a state, Africans in America. Whereas my wife, who comes from Barbados, is both a nation and a state. A state is the government that runs a country. And in the case of the Western conception of the state, it's the instruments of violence that's used by the government to control the people. Now, they'll always say these instruments of violence are to protect you from the outside. But the reality is, in African societies where you had kings and queens, I pointed this out before, Obenga and I both agree on this, for thousands of years of human history, there were no standing armies. Why? Because the state was not oppressive. That is, the government was not oppressive, and therefore did not need instruments of violence to protect itself from its own people. This is the key point. So these societies that are stateless are smart societies, particularly if you're looking at the European standard, protects them from the arbitrary power. But you're going to see that they even have advantages over the state societies, even though there are advantages that you have when you have a state, because the African state society had more justness than the state societies of Europe. Yet I'll say this, just as an assertion to start this off. The freest societies were the hunter-gatherer, and the next freest were the stateless societies. And that's the key point. Now, Dr. Chancellor Williams and most historians who specialize in ancient African history are wrong when they assert that democracy in Africa began in stateless societies. That's incorrect. Dr. Williams made that mistake because, and other historians, some of them have deliberately made the mistake because in creating this field of African historiography, they have excluded the world's first people from history. So generally, the people who study history, be they Black or white, most of them don't study this area. And that's why they could make the mistake in the case of African historians, if they reach this conclusion of concluding that democracy could occur after the hunter-gatherer period, when in fact they're the authors of democracy. And when Dr. Chancellor Williams asserted that democracy is the oldest government in the world, the reason it's the oldest is that it derives from the most ancient people and most ancient civilization in the world, Twa, starting with Kung and San, which are the same people. They're the first of the Twa people. And their societies were democratic to the core. Its ethos was democratic, the way it carried itself. Its philosophy was democratic. Every part of it was democratic. And that is the most important legacy it leaves for the world, starting with Africa. So, of course, democracy would be the oldest of government systems because it derives from the oldest of people, the Twa, who practiced a hunter-gatherer governance system of democracy. So that is the main reason. And this is extremely important. So this has a long history, and because of the length of this history, and because, as I point out in the integration trap generation gap caused by a choice between two cultures, I call this period of Twa history, not prehistory, but formative history. Why? Prehistory, technically, anthropologists mean a people without a writing. And that's often the case with these stateless societies as well. And a lot of them have problems dealing with them as well because they rely on an oral tradition that in many ways is more reliable than the written tradition for records, given the system that they have for training the people who carry on this historical memory, the jellies, that the French incorrectly call griots and others, who are required to maintain the highest standards of truth. But since the West likes everything in writing except what comes from their civilization, like Socrates that didn't put anything in writing, or Pythagoras who deliberately didn't because he was a student of the mystery systems of Kemet and was prohibited from doing so. And as a 22-year initiate, he was honest and followed the injunctions. And yet he was a major influence on Plato. And the West acknowledges him. But when you got societies that are oral and they're African, then they're going to pounce all over them. You know what I mean? But that's hardly the case. And it's interesting, as I pointed out before, In the written societies like Kemet, they valued the oral over the written, and they saw to it that writing imitated speech. And you won't get this until you go into inner Africa of today and realize why. Because it is the word, especially when it is spoken orally, that carries the vital force, that carries the power that can heal, the power that is based on truth. And that is the key. And we know that just because you write something doesn't make it true. And I'm a writer, so I'm not putting down writing. But my writing follows an oral standard. I write the way I speak because orality is what drives our culture. The most moving stuff is oral. You hear me? Malcolm X on Afro-American history. That's moving. That's a speech. Or Nyani, Sunjata, an epic of ancient Mali, one of the most eloquent books on African history, on the history of Mali. But it was oral, put into print. That's why it was so moving and so powerful. And so I don't follow white conventions. I'm not going to write in the dead third person. I'm going to write the way I speak, and I'm writing to audiences. You know, that's why I'm going to take these shows and turn them into books, because the oral part that I'm using here isn't too much different from the written part, except I go into more depth in the writing. So Chancellor Williams and historians who specialize in ancient African history, therefore, were wrong in asserting that history, when it comes to the history of democracy, began in stateless societies. They began in the hunter-gatherer societies, where democracy was practiced 24/7. Now, what Chancellor Williams and most historians on ancient Africa missed is the fact that Africa gave birth to democracy at the very beginning of human history, which is, according to mitochondrial DNA, 144,000 to 154,000, or minus 134,000 years ago. And some will say longer. So that's a long history of people having a say-so in running their society. When I say a say-so, they ran it, you know? And when you have people practicing this kind of governance for that long a period of time, it leaves an imprint on all other societies that follow it, a deep imprint. And that's the imprint that the Twa leave for what becomes stateless societies. And they also leave their imprint on the states, because the states also end up practicing, kings in their councils end up practicing consensus democracy in most cases. This is key to understand, this formative history. It's kind of like a person's history in the womb of their mother. And so consider Twa history as the womb of African and world history, and then its birth, and then its practice. And it's so deep that it's inside of not just the hunter-gatherers, but of the people that follow them. And it's been practiced for an extremely long period of time, that they worked the problems out of it. So it's a workable, and of all the democratic systems on the planet, the most just, the hunter-gatherer society. So when we see democracy being practiced in the stateless societies that are agricultural, that's the result of the imprint of the Twa, who also lay the foundation for agriculture that provide the basis for the operation of the stateless societies. So when agriculture is invented, which is the key feature of stateless societies, most of them are agrarian. Some of them are societies in which, like the Fulani, they're pastoralists, so they're moving with their herds, but there are also stateless societies. And the Dogon are stateless societies. So what we see in the imprint coming from the Twa, when it comes not only to democracy, but again, agriculture, is that the stateless societies inherit the system of agriculture from the Twa, who innovated it. And it was Twa women that innovated agriculture. They were the first to practice agriculture. And it's interesting that following that, most African societies that are agricultural, and most of them are, it's the women who are the agriculturalists. In some, it's the males and females. And in a very few, it's the males. The Yoruba, it's the males who are agriculturalists. The exceptions always prove the rule. So again, you're seeing a Twa foundation for this when it comes to the agrarian order, the agricultural order. Now, when did this period start? Dr. Clyde Ahmed Winters concludes that agriculture started in Africa around 16,000 BC. That's his conclusion. He's looking at migratory patterns in Africa, and particularly those going to the Nile Valley. But other historians say that it began around 10,000 BC. Whatever the period, it's an ancient period, and that is the period in which stateless agrarian societies begin in Africa. It's an ancient period. So while African stateless societies didn't give birth to democracy, the first agrarian societies of Africa were stateless societies, and they were democratic through and through. This is the key point. The Twa bequeathed democracy about 130,000 years after the hunter-gatherer period took place. They practiced it for 130,000 years, and then 10 to 16,000 years ago, pass on agriculture to agrarian societies. So why am I focusing on stateless African societies? And see, I also focus on Kemet, I focus on Africa as a whole. But right now, why am I focusing on stateless African societies without kings and queens, without social and economic stratification? The first reason is that the hunter-gatherer societies are the most ancient in Africa and in other parts of the world, and the agrarian democracies are the most ancient of the societies in Africa following the hunter-gatherer society. The second reason for focusing on this is that just as the Twa were foundational for African civilization, African history, African societies, the agrarian stateless societies are foundational for the societies that follow and have a major influence on the kingly and queenly societies. And we see how that worked in Kemet with the Anu people. They shaped the civilization of Kemet. They gave birth to it. They were the most creative people in the society. And it's interesting when we look at the Dogon, who are again coming from a stateless society, though they have Hogons who are priests who play an important role in terms of maintaining an order between heaven and earth as astrophysicists. The Dogons are the possessors of the deepest astrophysics on the continent. That's Dr. Finch's conclusion, and it's mine, even deeper than Kemet in many respects. Huh? And they're oral, and they're stateless. So if you're going to associate this with something backward because they didn't build pyramids or something, you're wrong. Just as the Twa, until they move into ancient Kemet, had not created monuments in the hunter-gatherer period because people who are moving hunter-gatherer, they don't have time to do that. But when they decided to build up Kemet, they did. They had the knowledge, they just didn't want to use it in that direction. So we look at the stateless societies because they're foundational for all societies that follow. Their institutions, culture, and philosophy are the basis for African states that follow. The third reason for looking at the stateless African societies is that next to the hunter-gatherer societies, they're the most just. Hey, Lawrence, right on, brother. Brother has done a lot to help advance this show. How you doing over there where you are? So they're the most just societies. My heart rings for justice. That's why I'm a Twa man first. Not just because they were first. They're the most truthful, most kind, most just. To me, in relationships, that's what comes first. The quality of character. That was something that the brothers who were talking about the Independent Black School, African Children's Advanced Learning Center, were stressing, that, they build up self-confidence through self-discipline. But it's really to develop balanced human beings. And so these societies were the most just societies after the Twa societies. So because of that, the people who are coming out of these agrarian democracies, these stateless societies, they lived the best lives of any Africans in Africa, better than most people in Kemet, other than the elite. You hear me? They were the people living in these stateless democratic societies that were the freest. They didn't have anybody over them telling them what to do. You hear me? That's important. And it should be real important for us today, Huh? So this is key. Living in the freest societies. And we know that for Africans in the diaspora who have undergone, and Africans on the continent who have undergone the colonial and enslaved experience, freedom is of great importance. Now, the Africans who found these stateless societies, and it's also true of the ones who found state societies, many of them, particularly in West Africa, migrate into the United States and into other parts of the Western Hemisphere, the Caribbean and South America. And so the cultures that they carry will be based heavily on the cultures developed in these societies. Kurt Thomas said, weren't these early societies matriarchal based? No. That's a mistake Cheikh Diop made. And if you read the book, Return to the African Mother Principle of Male and Female Equality, you'll see that I proved that Diop was wrong on that when he said that the societies of Africa were matriarchal and the societies of Europe were patriarchal. He was right about the patriarchal, but he was wrong on just about everything else that he said about what he called the northern cradle in European societies. They were not matriarchal. And in fact, there are very few matriarchies or patriarchies in Africa. And what Diop would often characterize as matriarchies, such as the Swazi in South Africa, because they were highly respectful of women, they were patrifocal. They inclined towards the male because when a woman entered the presence of a man, she got on her knee and kneeled to him, And you didn't inherit through the line of the mother. You inherited through the rank of the mother, but it was males who inherited, not females, according to the rank of the female. If it was a first wife, she had more power, then that's how inheritance was determined. And so Diop made the mistake of confusing respect with matriarchy, whether societies are matrifocal or patrifocal, meaning you live in the residence of the mother, matrifocal's family, or patrifocal, the father's family, or matrilineal, your descent is through the line of women, or patrilineal, descent is through the line of men. There's respect for women. There's a higher respect in the societies that incline towards females. But you'll see as I get into this analysis, and I've discussed this from another angle before, African families have to be characterized another way. Archy is also foreign to African thought, ruled by, that's matriarchal. Africans don't like that. And those are anthropological terms, so that's inaccurate. I'm not going to say until I get to this point what I call these family systems. People who have heard me before know what I call them, but I want to fit this into this analysis. So part of this show today, Africa, the birthplace of democracy, and a central principle in African American culture, the last part of this will look at how the culture, particularly of stateless societies, but we also carried them from states, was carried into the Caribbean, South America, and the United States. And I'm going to focus on the democratic components carried into this area here and in the other parts of the world. Now, I pointed out before that an anthropologist by the name of Gerhard Krauss made this observation about hunter-gatherer societies. He said this, and this is absolutely accurate. The hunting and gathering way of life is the original affluent society in which all of people's wants was easily satisfied. That's what people miss. And see, some of you have problems with me putting too much emphasis on these two. I know a lot don't, but some do, because you consider them quaint. Oh, they're hunter-gatherers. They don't live in palaces. They don't live in pyramids, but they laid the foundation for Kemet civilization that actually built them. They had the paranormal powers to do whatever they wanted to do. They innovated all kinds of features of civilization, including the notion of God that's perfectly consistent with physics and so forth and so on. But the key point is that saying that they are the original affluent society explains why they could stay in this circumstance for over 130,000 years. And they could have innovated agriculture a lot earlier. Why? Because they didn't go hungry. Their needs were met. they had shelter, and they had leisure. Most of their time was devoted to enjoying themselves and helping out nature and humanity. You know, what do they say about people in America? They work to live. What do they say about people in Europe? They live to work. Is that right? Well, it's the other way around. In this society, your livelihood is based on spending all your life working, and in other societies, it's you work, but you're able to live. In this society, you can barely live. So the point is that this is your original affluent society. Stateless societies are the thing closest to that. They are closest to that because next to the affluence that Africans experienced in stateless societies, you see in the stateless or in hunter-gatherer societies, you see in stateless societies, these are societies without rich and poor. There aren't people with extreme amounts of wealth. These are societies where women, as they were in the hunter-gatherer stage, are free from oppression from men, where the old are free from oppression from the young, and where children are regarded as the reward of life. And that's true both in the stateless societies and the state societies. But the highest level of these experiences come in the stateless societies. And the key thing in the stateless societies is there's no such thing as ownership of land, air, or water. The land, air, and water is shared. No one owns it. And that's why even when you get to the state system often wasn't brutal. Sometimes it became so, but often wasn't, because there was not great disparities of wealth. Some had a little bit more than others based on their work in the agricultural economy, but not great disparities. And the family was the unit through their collective work under a communal system where they left the land, air, and water in better condition than they received it. So the environmental thing, which is separate in this society and dishonored more than honored, was integral to the communal sharing society. So every person in these stateless societies, and this is also true for the state societies, every person had a share of land for use. He didn't own it, or she. They had land to build a house. Everyone had a roof over their head. No homeless people in these societies. No landless people. And the land was not purchased because you had no private property. So this is the state of people who live in these stateless societies, and it is generally the state of people who live in the societies with states, in that, again, sharing or communalism was the basis for human prosperity. And when you have what Chancellor Williams referred to as the later system of dictatorship or vicious monarchies, dictatorial monarchies, these are backed up by people, a handful, the kings and the rich, who control and own most of everything, including the United States. The so-called founding fathers that shaped the Constitution owned half the country. And so they shaped a constitutional structure designed to enable the rich to continue to control most of the wealth. Today, 1% controls 40, 50 or more percent of the wealth in this country. And there's very little left for everybody else. And that's not just true here, but that's true globally. If you look at this Constitution, it's a constitution of rights denied to us until the end of chattel slavery. But it's not a constitution of powers that empower people to have a roof over their head, to have a means of livelihood where they can make a good living, to be able to take care of their health without going broke, and to have an education that is worth having and that you don't have to pay to your neck for. So it sounds good, but try and eat rights. And I'm not against rights, but the right to free speech. But what about the right to a house, the right to a good livelihood, the right to a long life free of oppression? As long as you have private property in land and water and air, I'm not against private property in terms of whatever you've achieved through your labor, though extremes are no good. As long as you have that, you have oppression. And so these stateless societies and the state societies were both free of that, because the stateless societies provided, as the hunter-gatherer ones did before, the model for justice. What you have under this system, where a few have everything, you have what Fanon called the wretched of the earth. So many people are turned into wretchedness, which just means extreme poverty. To see all the homeless people in this country and growing around the Western world, but particularly this country and in the other poorer countries of the world, it hurts you in a society that could easily provide for all of them, you know? So this is key to these African systems. Now, according to Chancellor Williams, lineage was the most common force for unity in stateless societies. Lineages are the unit for a large congregation of families, people of the same bloodline. And so the stateless societies, the biggest unit of government was lineage. While there were clans were usually too big to be operational in terms of governing anything. And so the lineage is what tied people together, along with the extended family. And for enslaved Africans, that would be the extended family community. Lineage could not survive enslavement, because there's no way you're going to have on a plantation everybody of the same blood and enough of them to make up a lineage. And so lineages are the invention of agrarian societies, not possible under hunter-gatherer because they were small, usually 17, 18, 19, 20 people. And they were more extended families than lineages. So the question is, what's the secret behind the justness of the stateless societies? What's the secret? What's the secret behind everyone having a roof over their head, everybody having food in their stomach? And I should point out, having societies, as was true in the hunter-gatherer societies, that have no jails, technically no policemen, and in most cases, no standing armies. Now, of course, you're going to think, yeah, well, that's not good because later on we needed them. We had militias, and those militias were quite good. Ghana could field an army on a militia basis larger than any in Europe at that time. You know what I mean? And it did it at that time because invaders were coming in. So then they had to protect themselves in that way. So what's the secret behind the justness of these societies? Stateless societies had no leaders. That is, formal institutions of leadership. There might be people who situationally emerge who are looked up to, but no institutions of leadership. They had no state apparatus for force and violence. They had no spy system, though they did have something else that I'll refer to later, but it was not a spy system because spy systems are used against the people and then externally abroad against other people. So they didn't have a power-hungry group that had everything. So what's the secret of these just stateless societies? Overall, the secret is the people ran everything, okay? That's the overall answer. They ran everything. They didn't have no leaders up there telling them what to do. They were the leaders. Like the hunter-gatherer societies, where there were no leaders. So they had that. And by the way, we're going to see when we get into the African American situation, I'm sure it's true in the Caribbean and South American situation, how that applies in terms of our leadership concepts today. So they didn't have states. That's what enabled people to run everything. And where you had state systems in Africa at the village level, people ran everything. And that's something that African independence leaders didn't get straight. They should have allowed those economies to do their number because at independence, Africa was self-sufficient in food. But it's only when these blacks come in that they begin to act like colonizers that that begins to change. So the secret behind the people being able to rule, and I'm going to go back to this because you see, there's a grand truth here. And this is what ties all my stuff together. So if you hear it before, you don't really fully get it because like the question, that brother that asked the question about matriarchy, Kurt Thomas, he's new to the show, hasn't read my stuff, but he hasn't heard some of the analysis that I've done on this. But generally, most historians, almost all of them, have no grasp of what the secret was behind the justness of the hunter-gatherer societies. And if they had no inkling of that, then they would have no inkling of what the secret was behind the justness of agrarian, stateless societies. What was the secret? And it is this principle that is central to holding these societies together. And it is the basis for the expression and practice of democracy where the people rule, where African people rule. And so what is that? It is the twin lineal principle inherited from the Twa, where all the males and females are equally empowered to govern every phase of society. This is what stamps every feature of the agrarian stateless societies, as it stamps key features in the state societies. Indirectly, at the level of the king and queen rulership, where they represent males and females, but directly at the village level in those societies. So when we start with what Dr. Chancellor Williams noted was the glue that held stateless societies together, the lineage, what do we see with the lineage? How's it run? The lineage head like subsequently when you develop the state in Africa, the lineage head is the best person, the most truthful, the most brave, the most kind, the one that never curses, the one that never abuses women or children or elders. He's the best person. That same one was the one that would ascend to kingship. The women didn't have to ascribe to this standard. Isn't that interesting? The men did. And the women were there to see that they did, you know, often serving as the nominators for them in some societies. So at lineage level, how does lineage work then? It's the eldest, wisest, most just person that becomes the lineage head. But what does that lineage head do? It presides over the lineage that makes decisions, not the lineage head. Because all the males and females of the lineage are empowered to make the decisions, and the decisions are made through consensus. Are you getting this? So while Dr. Chancellor Williams is right that it's the lineage that is the glue to stateless societies, many of them at least, it is the governance of the lineage that is crucial. Now, of course, lineage heads are intermediaries with the spirit. And that's as important as the democracy, because Africans believed, and some still believe, that the prosperity of a people is due to ancestral protection. And so another reason why the lineage head has to be the best person, because it makes them the ones who the spirits respect. And if the spirits respect you, then the well-being of the lineage is assured. That's why Pharaoh in Kemet was supposed to represent this. Didn't always, as well as the Asante Hina and Asante Wa in the Asante system was supposed to represent this. And when they didn't, when they represented Isfet or wrongdoing, they brought harm to their people, because Ma'at is the rudder of heaven, the beam of earth. If you want to maintain harmony in a society, then you've got to pursue justice, speak truth, do truth. So male-female empowerment made the lineage head the first among equals, but it was the people that were the finer deciders. Now, stateless societies without kings and queens, therefore, were ruled directly by male-female empowerment. And one of the forms that was very popular for male-female empowerment, male-female rule, were age-grade societies. So stateless societies often were ruled through age-grade societies where people advanced through different grades based on age. And these different grades based on age had different responsibilities. And so the youngest group, they're at the stage of the young and they're learning. And then you've got the adolescent group, and then you've got the mature adult group, then you've got the older adult group, and then you've got elders. And so for each of these, there's responsibility in governing the society. But this is a formula, again, for carrying out the Trois formula for just societies, a twinlineal male-female empowerment, where all the males and females equally empowered to govern every phase of society. Because in the case of the classless age-grade societies, if you live long enough, you'll pass through every phase of the society, including getting to experience every phase of governance or of following if you're a child. So this was a key point in, again, how you had this prosperity in stateless agrarian societies, because the people were running it, in this case through age grade societies. This is another new institution that agrarian societies create, not practiced in hunter-gatherer societies, but they are following the same principle of male-female empowerment, and they're adapting it to a larger society. The stateless societies, when they were large enough, and sometimes later on, when they could face attack, ended up forming villages. Some of the societies in the Anu period, they were enclosed. Their settlements were enclosed to protect them from attack. And so this is what you call village democracy. Not all stateless societies operated on the village level, but when they were large enough and they made the choice, they did. And again, who made the decisions? The elders could recommend, but in both the stateless societies and the state societies, the people ran the village by all the males and females being empowered to make the decisions. Elders could make recommendations, but it was only the people who made the final decision, because even elders could be wrong. And again, consensus was the rule. Are you getting this? This is what you call grand theory, because this twin lineal thing applies to everything. The question the brother asked about matriarchy and patriarchy, I'm not getting into that today, which is the twin lineal system of governance at the family level. This covers the whole thing. You only get this when God gives it to you. You hear me? This twin lineal thing is the key to us rebuilding families and communities, and it is the formula for building just nations for us here, for Africa, for the Caribbean, wherever we are. Keep the woman out of it, for example, in your empowerment, and you're not going to be fully empowered. You're going to be weak. So that the level of the man is level, measured by the level of the woman. The level of the woman is also measured by the level of the man. And so this is key in this just empowerment system. Another institution that was central to stateless agrarian societies and found in some state societies were the secret societies. Now, I've talked about secret societies to an extent before. These were societies that emerged especially during the period of enslavement and colonialism. And so the elders in the society formed secret societies so that the culture of Africa could be preserved when it was under attack. And so this is where bush schools come in. This is where the Poro Society, that is the largest of the secret societies in West Africa, that Senku was a part of, who led the revolt on the Amstead. This is where they came from. These secret societies would be carried into the Americas and into the United States. And we'll see the role that they played in the United States. But in Africa, they consisted of bush schools. And these were schools set up in the bush. They were used for initiation into manhood and womanhood. They were used for training people into higher level of skills in the society. And at the same time, um, they were used for initiating people into higher levels of wisdom. These were, in fact, these secret societies were, in fact, at one point, the model that Kemet drew from when they created their mystery systems. And in fact, when you look at the society of the priest among the Yoruba, the Babalao, the priest, the diviner, that means father of mysteries, someone who goes through deep training so that they can minister to the needs of our people, healing needs, prophetic needs, a whole lot of things. They were the leaders on the plantation during enslavement. Most enslaved Africans in America were not Christians. And they dropped that system into what's called Black Christianity, which is voodoo, designed to bring the spirit down. So what we see then in stateless societies is that they carried the democratic traditions of hunter-gatherer societies into larger agricultural societies, but operated in the same way as rulers of every phase of their life. And they could live well because they were free of hierarchy or someone telling them what to do. So this is stateless societies. And I just want to note, because Chancellor Williams wasn't able to list them, I'll give you the names of some of them. Millions of Africans live in stateless societies today. Not as many as live in states, but they live in stateless societies. So in West Africa, we find them along some of the rivers, the Cameroon Mountains, and in certain plateaus of West Africa. So millions of Africans live in this stateless society. Among them are the Igbo. You saw that on the leaflet for this show. The one in the middle, they're having a conversation. Igbo, but they're just one of many of the stateless societies. The Ibibio, the Ijo, IJO, the Tiv, the Adoma, the Barom, the Mimbi, the Yako. These are all in West Africa. They're all over Africa. The Ikoi, further west and north of the Volta headwaters, which is close to where, in some places where Ghana is, and in other areas, the Niger Bend, we find the Logaga. We find the Bobo, B-O-B-O, the Dogon. And in the Ivory Coast and in Guinea, you find the Kisi, the Don, the Gago, the Kru. And then in West Africa, other regions of West Africa, you also find other concentrations of stateless people. And stateless shouldn't sound like they lost something. They're really free. So how was this system of democracy carried to the Americas and to the United States? I have a one-sentence definition of African American culture. I'm not going to go into it today, but it's a very complex culture. But one of the core tenets of African American culture is democracy. Democracy. You hear me? And how do we know this? By the practice of the people. Some things that I would say overall about democratic traditions of Blacks in the United States, particularly. because democracy is key to all African people in the diaspora, but I'm going to focus heavily on the U.S. and in some cases share the Caribbean where I can safely do so. So what are some indications that democracy would be central to our culture? One, the African American hates hierarchy. We hate anybody over us telling us what to do. Now you can say, oh yeah, everybody. No, everybody doesn't follow that. No, white people don't follow that. They generally follow the person on top, especially if they just give them a few goodies or a smile or lie to them, like Trump, a fake populist. They'll fall for it. But you and I, we don't like anybody over us telling us what to do. This makes us Twa-like in quality, but also stateless-like. But that was the feature also of the Africans in the villages of state societies. You couldn't come in there telling them what kind of crop to grow, how much to charge, like these independence leaders did. One of the major transmitters of this democratic principle in the US and in the Caribbean were the Igbo people, but they're not the only ones. But they were called, as I pointed out in a previous show, the Flying Africans. The song, the spiritual song, wade in the water, children. God's going to trouble the water. That isn't what you think it is. That's referring to Igbo people going to the water and drowning themselves because they preferred death to slavery. And they believed they were free when their spirits returned home. Most slave masters didn't want Igbos because they were so democratic that in their tradition, they said that when you picked your destiny in heaven, we actually argued with God. Huh? And while with colonialism, the colonizer appointed some Igbos as chiefs and kings, the Igbo reject that. So they are an important ethnic group in the United States. But other African ethnic groups carried the same principle of democracy, direct or indirect. So the principle of democracy was such a strong feature of African cultures, stateless and state, that it became a constituent part of the nature of African people, starting with the hunter-gatherer societies, then with the stateless societies, and then in the villages of Africa under the state societies, so that the African coming to the Americas had this bred into them, this spirit of freedom. And they resented every ounce of enslavement and resisted it as much as they could. And it was this democratic spirit that was key to this. It was not the sole reason. I mean, they were young. They saw their lives before them. They had a sense of destiny. They knew no one was destined to be a slave, let alone a slave treated as property. But the key thing is they breathed, slept, dreamed freedom. And freedom was expressed through democracy, through having a say-so in your life. So we don't know how the enslaved governed themselves on the plantation. We do know they had their own leaders. We do know they had secret societies on the plantation. The Loyal League was one of them. And so, we do know that there were various ways in which Africans expressed their will. And of course, we know it through the escapes. We know it through slave rebellions. We know it through sabotage. But we best know it by what they did at the end of enslavement. And this is real key. Real key. So this principle of male-female empowerment the very basis of democracy was key to our survival here. And I want to say that the most important expression of this came in the family. The extended family community, which was the one that brought you in and loved you when you were separated from family. But with the end of enslavement, as I pointed out before, Black people maintained two-parent households from 1865 to 1968. 75% of them were two-parent households. This is twin lineal male-female cooperation. With very few resources, we stayed together. All families weren't pretty. They were of a great variety. But that is what enabled us to get the love and to survive. And so this is a high expression of twin linealism. Now, there's much more in the family that I'm not going to go into here. But a very important feature of the continuation of the democratic principle in African American culture is this. I pointed this out before. In the midnight of enslavement, we recreated a new African culture, whereas it was just extended in the Caribbean because you were the majority on the land. Here it came under attack, so you had to recreate it, but drawing on fundamental African principles. But how was it created? It was not created by a single author. It was not a group of house Negroes that got together and say, this is our culture, pretty much imitating the master. The culture was created by the grassroots, field Blacks. There is no single author because it was authored collectively by the people. You want to talk about some democracy under fire? You hear me? And it was a great display of creativity, which is the ethos of the African American, you know. In fact, improvisation and innovation are expressions, democratic expressions of creativity. So when we look at the creation of the art form, the spiritual blues, which is the foundation for all the art forms in New African or African American culture, it was gifted artists who shaped most of those beautiful songs, but it was the mass of Black people who accepted or rejected these creations. And we have the art form because the people made the decision to accept so much. You understand? You didn't have a voting booth. Haven't you noticed when Black people move, it ain't no voting booth? You know, when we decide to stand up, we move in the same direction. You hear me? That's what happened in the creation of this new African culture. And the older, the more beautiful, because it's more African. It's more funky. It's more soulful. As Du Bois said, it contains the souls of Black folks. And we took out of misery and made beauty. We took out of ugliness and transformed it into something magnificent. And that's what most of our artists say. We're here to bring beauty out of ugliness. That's why our art form always, the musical art form always includes poetry. The spoken art form, poetry. Because that's kind of like the language of God. As my good friend Upesi Mtambuzi, who's passed on to the other side, for Black people, poetry is not a luxury, poetry is a necessity. Hello. Huh? But these were democratic expressions, and it's the unusual family that doesn't have a poet in it. Some like me, amateur, but poets nevertheless. Now, while we don't know exactly how decisions were made on the plantation, we know they were made in secret. You know? And usually if you're plotting a rebellion, you're not going to go out and announce it. And the spirituals were symbolic songs hiding a message because we knew we weren't free. But the key thing about the plantation was that Black people got together, cooperated, and made decisions together. They usually didn't escape just on their own, usually in a group. That was a democratic decision of that particular group. But Nell Irvin Pointer, who is a great African-American historian, she's authored a book called The Exodusters. I think it's her best work. She made the point that with emancipation, rural Blacks made decisions collectively where all the males and females in that community or in that group got together and they hammered out a decision based on consensus. They were using the same method used in Africa. And so what was the notion of leadership? Leadership, or leaders, who the Blacks would send to negotiate with whites, were the mouthpieces of the people. They were telling whites what they were told to tell them by the people. That was the common decision making in the South. Did you know that? They were carrying out consensus-based democracy that came out of these stateless societies, and the villages of Africa had their root in hunter-gatherer societies. What was the basis of African-American religious preference? Because we don't embrace Christianity, and it's on voodoo terms after enslavement. We picked those churches that gave us the greatest leeway in expressing ourselves democratically and emotionally and spiritually. And so it was the Baptist church. And then later, which we created on our own, Pentecostal. That was the basis for selection, because you could pick your leaders and remove your leaders. Again, democracy, was key. If we look at the mass movements that Black people have put forward, as Cabral said, they're expressions of culture. And what is the core expression of the culture? A key principle in the culture is democracy. As King said of the Montgomery bus boycott, he said he was amazed that people could be so disciplined in their expression of freedom. That's a definition of improvisation, and that's about as democratic as it gets. But it requires discipline. You just can't do something and do it right unless you have the discipline. But the discipline is the path to freedom. This is the real nature of democracy as it is expressed in African American culture, particularly in its highest art form, jazz, which is an aristocracy of democracy. The aristocrats, the Duke Ellingtons, the Lady Days, the Count Basies, and the democracy, the improvising of music that comes from your soul based on the discipline of practice and the gifts that God has bestowed within you. So the democratic spirit is at the core of African American culture. If you look at Marcus Garvey, the Honorable Marcus Garvey, he was dictatorial personally, but in his conventions, he had to be elected. He wasn't going to be provisional president of Africa by calling himself that. The people had to make that decision. And at the local level, it was Asante democracy. I don't think he knew this was an Asante tradition, but at every local chapter, you had a male president and a female president, vice president and female vice president, male secretary and a female secretary, treasurer, and so forth. That was Asante democracy. A large number of people from Jamaica are of Asante origin. So in this case, you're wielding together the principles of stateless societies of male-female empowerment and of state societies of the aristocratic thing, which in Ghana would be the stool of the king, the Asantehene, and the stool of the Queen Mother. And that's replicated in the organizations we find in the Garvey movement. So, in conclusion, sometimes when you look at the smallest stuff, you get the biggest stuff. So, the agrarian stateless societies were not the largest in terms of the number of people who participated in them. But they were the foundation for all other agrarian societies that followed. And they were a key to not only how Africans could be free of oppression and enjoy a good life, but if you dip into these, you can get ideas for how to reconstruct and restructure the societies that you're living under today. Africa still has in its villages these practices I'm describing. Yeah, they've been somewhat distorted, but they're still there. In the United States, in the Caribbean, in South America, we still draw from these traditions. We need to take the best of them, update them, and use them in taking a society that's crooked and making it straight, unjust and making it just. And the empowerment of males and females is key. What we're seeing is the group-centered leadership of groups like Black Lives Matter or the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. That goes back to the earliest democracies coming out of hunter-gatherer societies, where you had no leaders. Everybody was a leader. So we need to draw from the best of our past to transform our present and to create a better future. Hotep. Hope you got something out of that. Let's see if people got any comments here. Wolf Manlu, I never looked at jazz as a democracy before. To me, it was structured chaos. No, it's a democracy. It's an aristocracy of democracy. And that democracy is really expressed through the freedom of each musician to express themselves. Now, some composers like Duke Ellington would actually compose music for every horn, every player. But even then, they also had other pieces where musicians would play their own stuff. But it's a combination of practice, some who practice having more gifts than others, and then the ability to go inside your soul and come up with something new. That's not chaos. And by the way, the idea of chaos doesn't exist in African philosophy. Disorder, not chaos, because chaos has no rhyme or reason. Thank you, Yvette. And I hope you got something out of the show that we had on the schools last week. Thank you, Robin. Now let's see, are there any comments or questions here? Let me see. Okay. Jazz is transcendent. You better believe that. Thanks, Worley Smith. Appreciate that. Let's see if there's some comments or questions here. Chad Jomo Kenyatta, Curtis Mayfield. Yeah, Curtis Mayfield was a prophet of the movement. And he was talking about freeing your mind. He was talking about the beauty of Blackness. He was talking about the beauty of ghetto women. His movement reflected the Black freedom movement, and it also provided hope and direction for it. His song, We're a Winner, it was reflecting the wins we were chalking up at that time. Because we are, right on. Yes, poetry is not a luxury, is the title of one of the most widely recognized essays from the great poet Audre Lorde in her seminal work, Sister Outsider. Right on. Yeah. And that's the beauty of our novelists really do a good job in terms of bringing the poetry into the literature. The best history is written like a novel, you know. Oh, Wolf Manlou, today is the anniversary of the death of Marvin Gaye. What's going on? Yeah, beautiful singer. Wolf Manlou, I used to study ants. I see so many correlations with African societies, ancient, and ant colonies. Yeah. And in fact, a lot of things about nature have been the basis for inventions, and particularly African inventions. Wolf Manlou, so the reunited snakes of America even plagiarized our democratic principles, but altered it so that the few prosper the most. Yeah, they only used the words democracy. They didn't practice a bit of it. You know what I mean? And that's because they want to stay on top and keep everything. Thanks, Hire Hicker. You like this outfit, huh? Yeah, I decided to honor our stateless Africans with this one. Wolf Manlou, a secret hidden organization is needed shows how wonderful the ancient way of ruling was. These societies were protection of the righteous culture. That's true. Wolf Manlou, freedom in a sense that you could be as free as imaginable when you don't encroach on others or go against Ma'at. Yeah, and that's what generally happens when the people are in power. They're not going to let that happen. You know what I mean? No way. Wolf Manlou, this shows that the family unit is the knitting needle for a town, state, or nation to be just in ruling the people. Yeah, and I had a conversation with John Henry Clark after I had been in Ghana and different parts of Africa. This was 1990, and observed the operation of how villages were run. And this was after I received the vision for the Just Society that also came in 1990. And so I was talking to John about how beautiful the lineage system was in Ghana. And John made this observation. He said, what he liked about the Ghanaian system, and this is true for a good part of Africa, was its consistency. John could be very precise with few words. What did he mean? The way the lineage was run was the way the village was run, was the way the district was run, was the way the region was run, was the way the nation was run. So that consistency and family at the foundation. So the lineage head had the same qualities as the Asante Hina or king. And in fact, it was usually a lineage head who became king. So yeah. Wolf Manlou, so that the balance of male female or female male in smaller society transferred to larger ones when the people enforce that. Yes. And notice the way they ran their slick trick in this country is they came up with what they call checks and balances. The executive is supposed to check one branch of government. The judicial is supposed to check another branch of government, and the legislative. In fact, money controls all of it. Corporate money There's no checks and balances. The strong run everything. When I say strong, I mean the rich, the powerful. They could be crippled, but they got the power to impose their will. So there's no checks and balances. So what this system was good at was taking the people out of the equation while making it appear that they were in it. Through a Bill of Rights that was added on after the Constitution was written. But the way the Constitution is written, it's designed so that it's very hard to change it, for example, because it was set up to keep the rich in power. So these were some very smart, slick people that set this up. We saw through it, but a lot of others haven't. Look at how they could take the manufacturing base of this country and send it abroad and consult nobody. The government made no decisions on that. The people were asked nothing about it, just like you're not consulted over whether or not you can keep a job or get one. You know what I mean? So who's running America? The ones who own it. That needs to change. Okay. Kurt Thomas, he has some of my works. You can get the others by going to this hashtag below the screen, and it shows you, I think, how you can get to the books or underneath the screen when we come out of this. Higher heck, a modern man, woman may need a system designed for a just society. Yeah, and it needs to be total. Some systems address only the economic end of it. Basically, Marxism does that, equitable distribution of the wealth. But if you don't have equal empowerment throughout the society, then though you can profess that, someone else will usually end up being in charge. And the wealth is not going to be equally distributed. But you need even more than that. Ancient African mindset. Yeah, that's true. The first people in China, Japan, the Philippines were Anu, Ainu, just as they were the first in Kemet. Okay. Okay. Yeah, you go to Gumroad to get the books, not Amazon. And Amazon is charging all kinds of money depending on the site. Yvette Anderson, I wish we had schools in New York like yours. My grandchildren need it. Check and see. There may be some in New York, but we need to organize more of these, Yeah, you get my books through Gumroad. Worley Smith, our communities need to form small clubs for collective dialogue and address common problems. Yeah, some are doing that, through networking. using a computer kind of thing. So there are a variety of ways to do it, but yeah. Wolf Manlow, we here in Chicago really have no idea of how powerful it really can be. Yeah, with over 600,000 Black people in Chicago, come on. You know what I mean? Okay, well, I hope people got something out of that. Next week, we'll be going into part 2 of the Independent Black School African Children's Advanced Learning Center, HOTEP.